Hello Year 8, it's Mrs Tansley here from the PE department. This video contains all the information you need to know for your summer term PE exam. In this video you're going to learn about synovial joints, movement at joints and muscle contractions. So synovial joints. They are often referred to as freely movable joints. Make sure you've got a pen and a piece of paper and you can make notes. They're found between bones and they move against each other to allow free movement during physical activity. There are 3 types of synovial joints. So write a list of 3 and let's fill in the information. Ball and socket joints allow movement in all directions. So with one hand, make a fist, and in the other hand, make like a cup shape. Put the fist into the other hand and move it around. So you've got a ball and a socket and it can move in all directions. An example of this is your shoulder joint and also your hip joint. The second type of joint you need to know about is a hinge joint where we have bending and straightening. You can see the example there. It's your elbow joint. Can you think of another part of your body that has a hinge joint? It's your knee. It bends and it straightens. And the third type of joint is called a pivot joint, which is where you get rotational movement. And the example here is your neck joint. You can move your head from left to right, and that is rotational movement. Also, the same happens in your wrist. So the movements at joints. We have, write this down, you ready? Flexion, so bending a joint where you are decreasing the angle at your joint. The opposite of flexion is extension. You are straightening a joint. We have something called abduction, which is movement away from the midline of the body, and something called adduction, which is movement towards the midline of the body. I always like to remember adduction as it's adding back to your body. So think if we did a star jump, if you go out into the star position, you have abducted your arms and your legs away from the midline of your body, and then you do adduction, so you adduct your arms and your legs back towards the midline of the body. Something called circumduction, which is a circle movement of a limb. We have rotation, where the movement turns around its long axis. Plantar flexion, bending the ankle joint so the foot moves away from the body. And dorsiflexion, straightening the ankle joint so the foot moves towards the body. So an example of that, if you think about dance, we've got good toes, pointing your toes, and naughty toes, pulling your toes back up. Make sure you've written them all down. So an example of flexion is curling your arm up. And an example of extension is extending your arm back. So you're flexing and extending. Next one, abduction is going into a star jump position, so taking your hands up away from your body. And adduction is bringing them back in. Circumduction would be rotating your arm around a shoulder joint. So if you did some circles of your arm to loosen up in your warm-up, you are using circumduction. And rotation is where you are rotating your head from left to right. Plantar flexion, pointing your toes. Dorsiflexion, lifting your toes back up. So where do these movements take place? Which joints? Have a look at this table, pause the screen now and write this down. Flexion takes place at the shoulder, elbow and knee joint. Extension takes place at the shoulder, elbow and knee joint. Abduction and adduction take place at the hip and the shoulder joint. Circumduction takes place in the shoulder. Rotation takes place at the hip and the shoulder. And plantar flexion and dorsiflexion takes place at the ankle. That shouldn't say dorsiflexion, it should say dorsi. Okay, so let's link this to sport. So where will we see flexion? Have a look at these pictures. We've got a bicep curl. His arm is flexing up at the elbow joint. We've also got the end of a 10-pin bowling move. landing of a long jumper, and bending the knee, raising your leg to kick a football. Sporting examples of extension: throwing a shot put, when you land in a long or a triple jump, going to kick a football, and following through after kicking a football. Abduction: this man here is doing the crucifix position on rings in gymnastics. And adduction is when you come back out of the star jump, which I talked about earlier on. Circumduction would take place in a cricket bowl because your shoulder is rotating, your shoulder joint is moving round through its full range of motion. And rotation takes place in a golf swing. Plantar flexion, pointing the toes in ballet. And dorsiflexion when you are lunging or squatting. You need to know the muscles and bones that operate the shoulder, elbow, hip, knee, and ankle joints. So pause it here and write this all down. How muscles work in pairs. Muscles can only work in pairs. They can only pull a bone into a position. They cannot push a bone back. So these are called antagonistic muscle pairs. The muscle that shortens and contracts is called the agonist, and the muscle that relaxes whilst the agonist is contracting is called the antagonist. So put your hand on the top part of your arm over your bicep and your tricep with your hand extended out fully. Make a fist with your hand and now do a bicep curl up. You should be able to feel that your bicep is tight at this point and the tricep on the bottom of your arm is loose. As you then extend it back out, your tricep gets tight and your biceps loose. So the muscle that's tight is called the agonist, and the muscle that's loose and relaxed is called the antagonist. So we need to know that the biceps and triceps work as a pair. Quadriceps and hamstrings work as a pair, and there's some others here as well that you can see you need to write down. Finally, there are two types of muscle contractions that you need to know about. The first one is called isometric muscle contraction. This is where your muscles are being worked, but there is no change in their length. The best example for this is when you're doing a plank. To remember that there's no change in length, think of the word metric, which is just kind of the posh word for a meter ruler, maybe. It's a fixed length. You can't change the length of it, so it's exactly the same. So isometric, there is no change of length to the muscle. Isotonic has two types of contractions. We've got concentric contraction and an eccentric contraction. So go back to putting your hand on the bicep again. As you lift your wrist, your biceps contract and the muscle gets shorter. So that's called a concentric contraction. As you lower the wrist down, if you had a weight in your hand, you couldn't just quickly flop it down. You'd have to slowly lower the wrist and your biceps are still being worked, and it's called an eccentric contraction. That's the end of this video. Make sure you've got all the notes down in preparation for your exam.